All right, Josh. Thanks for being here today, brother. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Heard great things about you from Bert. I started paying attention to you. Probably I'm one of those late onset hunter guys. So
Yeah.
yeah, I spent the last 30 years coaching football. Coached 10 years of college ball, and then when I started my own businesses, I still coached high school for about another 20, 23 years. So it's the first year I'm not coaching football, and like somehow the hunting thing just like bit me last October, and I've been paying attention to it ever since, and paying attention to you and your brand. Um, I kind of wanted to start with this Instagram post you put up back in February, if you don't mind. I
Yeah,
love
go ahead.
this. Um, this was the map, I guess, after a big drop, showing where all the knives came from. It said, "Let this map be a lesson from last night's drop. To those of you who said my MKC was not going to work, you have to use China. You're a small regional brand. Hunting is too offensive to build a brand on. Instagram will censor you. You're crazy for quitting a union job." There's a long list. Um, you won't find enough employees in Montana. I say we're just getting started. Wait till you see what we've got planned. Get on board or get out of the way.
Yeah.
Man, I love that. What that was less to me of almost like kind of a challenge to a lot of
Yeah.
people that had told you probably for a long time that this isn't really going to work. Where did that come from, and like how long had you been hearing that?
Yeah, it was interesting actually. One of my what I would consider pretty good friend, knife maker, his name is Mike, and he when I was telling him about my idea uh, for MKC, um, he was showing me some knives that he was doing over in China, some folding knives, and
Mm-hmm.
he was one of several knife makers that said, like, man, there's some pretty good quality being made over in China, and there's no way to compete against these companies making stuff in China, and like just basically gave me a list of 100 reasons why it's too hard to do it in the U.S. And they're not entirely wrong from the standpoint that it's not easy. It would actually be a lot easier probably to present some engineer plans for a knife, some exact perfect drawings, and then just send it off and wait for them to show up at my door and then try to market them and sell them. But that's not honestly, maybe I'd make more money that way, but that's just not the way I envisioned uh, a company that I lead. That I'm a knife maker. I've been a knife maker for 30 years, and to then turn around and from making custom knives to just basically printing them in China, that does nothing for our community. That does nothing for our country. It doesn't do anything for good jobs, and it's just none of the things that I feel like are important. Does it actually accomplish other than maybe making somebody some money? And there's also no story there. Like, now then you're just trying to tell people why your Chinese made knives are better than the other Chinese made knives. So there was that, and then there were just a lot of friends that thought I was absolutely crazy for quitting a job where you're making $100,000 a year, and um, paid vacation and benefits and all that. And again, they're not necessarily wrong. Like, there's a lot of people that quit their jobs and try something and it doesn't go well, but uh, I don't know. I felt like it was possible, and I hate, it bothers me when people say like the American dream's dead. That the United States is completely unfair. You can't get ahead. Like, I think it definitely is tough. It's hard, but is it any harder for us today than it was for my great great grandfather who took a train out west and just picked out a chunk of land and started farming it? Like, I don't. In fact, I could argue that in a lot of ways today, it's easier than it was back then.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, a lot of that comes down to what people's expectations are today, and what they think is too hard versus what our grandparents thought was too hard, and even maybe our parents. You know, I know I'm from a family of farmers on both sides as well. So, you know, I know where that comes from. It's one of the things that I find interesting about you and Montana Knife Company that I've kind of seen a lot in the hunting industry, but even in some other industries, is that the the resurgence of American manufacturing seems to be coming back a lot from small businesses as opposed to large corporations, which I think is really neat because you're able to establish a different kind of brand as opposed to like a big corporate brand.
Yeah, and I think large corporations are generally based off of one thing, which it's just entirely the bottom line and its
That's right.
margins and its
Yep.
money. And I think a lot of smaller businesses, one, maybe they don't even have like for myself, for example, even if I wanted to make knives in China, I don't have those connections, and I don't necessarily have those the expertise or know-how to go vet a Chinese manufacturing company about how to make stuff for me. But number two, I think small companies are generally just they're individuals who have a deep love for our country, and it's not just about the bottom line. Like I've always said, if I can just make a good, solid living doing what I love, and I can do that the rest of my career, that's a win versus doing a job that maybe I don't want to do. Um, the other thing with American manufacturing, it's interesting. Like I'm, starting to look at property for what would be our next move for our next building. And I was talking to a guy locally here that has a piece of property that I'm talking about with him. And, we talked about what's good for a community. Frenchtown is a small town. It's a couple thousand, few thousand people. Mostly it's a bedroom community to Missoula. Everyone actually that lives out here pretty much works in Missoula, suburb kind of. And on his piece of property, I asked him what he would rather see. Would he rather see, this is a piece of commercial ground right along the interstate, right off the exit. Would he rather see, let's say, 2 or 3 hotels and maybe a McDonald's or a Starbucks, kind of the typical stuff you see at an interchange? For our town, would he rather see that? Which that's gonna hire, a hotel's gonna hire 15, 20 employees at probably as low a wage as they can possibly pay them, and maybe pay a manager a decent wage. Or on that same piece of property, would you rather see a manufacturing company that has goals of hiring 500 or 600 employees? Some of those people entry level wages, a lot of those people at a mid level wage, and also a bunch at a very, very high wage. Engineers, business managers, marketing people, stuff like that. A ton of jobs that are 80, 100, $150,000 a year. And also a place where high school kids can go get a summer job, like assembling knives for the summer. We have summer kids right now that, well, a couple of my kids that are off on break right now for summer from high school, and then a couple kids that are off on break for summer from college, and they're just temporary help until August or September. For that same piece of property, if you put manufacturing on it, it can potentially add and bolster an incredible amount of revenue for this valley, for our town, plus the school system. And that money will be kept here locally versus a Hilton hotel chain that's going to hire 15 or 20 low-level employees, and all that money is going to go away, and they're going to give a shit about the local Pee-wee football team or softball team or 4-H club.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself just in the last probably 10 years, especially paying a lot more attention to where my money goes, making sure that it goes to every opportunity I can to local businesses. If it's not a local business, trying to make sure it goes to businesses that are using mostly American source products, American made products. So those are, I think that's awesome that you're doing that. And I think the brand itself is so cool. Before I kind of go into that, I would love to hear the story about your grandparents, because I'm really intrigued by people who settled the West. Where did they come from, and what did that story look like?
My grandma, I think her family was based out of Ohio. And then My grandfather's family, I think, was based out of New York, if I'm not incorrect. And it was actually interesting. My great great grandfather wanted to marry my great grandmother, and uh, basically he didn't have a pot to pee in, and I think my great great grandmother had uh, parents that had high expectations for who she was going to be married to, as most fathers do for their daughters. And so her dad would not agree to let him marry her until he had uh, his own property and his own like respectable way of life, income. So he took a train out to Southeast Colorado and got off the train and ended up homesteading or laying claim to a pretty massive amount of property, a big giant ranch that at the time looked great to him because the grass, I think, was, the stories are the grass was 3 or 4 feet deep, and it was like 80,000 acres, and he thought he'd be able to run, you know, tons and tons of cattle. And so he laid claim to this land, and then he went back and showed her dad the deed, and he then agreed to let his daughter marry him. And so they came out, they dug a hole in the ground, and they built a dugout home. It's still actually kind of there. It's actually collapsed and caved in, but it's still there. The hole is, and the rubble on top of it. But they built probably 3 feet or so down, 4 feet down in the ground, and then about 4 feet on top of the ground was their first home. And then later on, they ended up building a small homestead next to that one, all above ground. And then later on in life, my grandma and my grandpa, moved away from that particular location and just moved across the ranch a couple miles and built a house there where my dad was born. As it turns out, that was very, very dry country. So once the cows ate all the grass, it didn't grow back. And they ended up with just a super dry, hard way of life, which my uncle still runs the ranch. It's a lot less acres now, but it's still pretty sizable.
Is that local? Is that where
Southeast
you are?
Colorado.
Oh, Southeast Colorado. Okay, that's right.
Yeah, and it's funny because then my grandma ended up having 16 kids. My dad has 14 or 15 brothers and sisters, 11 girls and 5 boys, and they're actually all still alive today. It's actually quite
That's
incredible.
amazing. Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, but very difficult way of life out there on, in the middle of nowhere, basically creating. I asked my grandma what the best invention in her life ever was, because she grew up in that like 1920 to, she died in her 90s, so 1920 time frame to the late teens of the 2000s. And as to what the best invention that she ever, like, what had the biggest impact on her, and she said, without hesitation, it was a telephone. She said to be able to call a doctor for her kids, to be able to call her sister in another state, to just be able to communicate when you're on a farm in the middle of nowhere was massive. I always admire those people from that generation, because they literally went from, World War II time frame to podcasts and FaceTime, and they've seen the invention of the internet and cars and electricity and telephones and like all the stuff that became commonplace for all of us.
Yeah. No, I asked my grandparents that before, and they're both passed. My grandma said the same thing. She said the telephone. My grandfather said the combine.
Yeah, I bet.
But they had about 4,000 acres that they farmed with, but it was a community, right? I mean, just like a lot of what I see in the hunting community, since my community forever has been this football community, this coaching community, which is interesting because they're really good guys and you really have a lot of camaraderie. But at the same time, especially like in the college level, there's a lot of competition and they kind of will help you to a certain extent. But everyone's always kind of worried about, whether they're going to burn, a contact or something helping you that they can't cash in on later. which that was one of the things that kind of drove me out of it after a while. But hunting and the brands that are associated with hunting and the people, like I've been really blessed to get tied into to Bert, to Joe Miles, to a few guys that are really big in the community, and it's amazing how giving and willing people are, who don't even know you, to help you learn something, which is what I'm trying to do right now, is learn a lot about it. And it seems like in listening to your podcast and watching you build your brand, like that's such a huge part of your company, is the community behind it.
Yeah, for sure. That it's massive. And honestly, that was kind of the community when I grew up making knives, like the custom knife makers, at knife shows and whatnot. This was pre-internet where you had to go to shows to sell knives. Um, Unlike other art forms, they were actually very open and very sharing, and would tell their competitors, quote unquote, um, how to do different things and teach different techniques, and which made their competition better. But it was kind of a rising tide lifts all boats situation, and in the hunting world, we've been very, very lucky. I think we're also kind of fortunate for what particular uh, product we make. A knife is a lot like a Yeti cooler. Um, it doesn't it doesn't really compete with camo companies and backpack companies and optics companies. We're kind of a complementary uh, piece of gear that goes along with any of that stuff. So I don't think we've been very threatening to most people in the outdoor brands, and the outdoor world's just been incredibly helpful to us. And I hear what you're saying, because my cousin was in college football coaching for a long, long time, and he just got out in the last couple of years, and quite frankly, I think got passed up for a couple head coach jobs that he really should have had. And it really got to a point where it was more of who and politics, and what, even with a lot of these schools, like, well, this guy, we're going to hire this guy because he's coming from this area of the country where we want to recruit. So, even though you might be more qualified to actually coach, this guy comes with a black book or a Rolodex of connections that can help the school. And it gets kind of dirty feeling, honestly. It felt like, to me, just watching from the outside.
Yeah, it was, I think. And if he just got out recently, I got out, I was doing it 92 to early 2000s, and then I got out then, just same kind of thing. I was tied into certain people, and if those people don't get jobs when you're young, then you're kind of, I was working 90 hours a week making 28,000 at a job that 400 other people wanted. So it was like, but there were only certain jobs that paid back then. The industry pays a lot better now, but just the
Yeah,
cut.
and even that being said, like, especially with the college coaching level up here, I don't think those guys are getting paid real well if you're not, one of the top two or three jobs. And you're right, if you're not from a specific coaching tree, then all of a sudden, you're passed up. And yeah, he just got out like 2 years ago, and
What school is he
then
at?
the transfer. He was at Montana State.
Oh, okay.
He bounced around like all college coaches do, from
Right.
high school coaching, and then bounced all the way up through all the different levels of colleges. Was a head coach at a frontier school, and then was assistant head coach at Montana State, and also did special team stuff. But it was he was very professional. He'd never complained to me. Just things I observed, and I saw the hours that he put in, which is just ridiculous.
It is insane.
Yeah, it's just insane. And what also changed so much too was the transfer rules and the recruiting, and just everything about, from the time that he started, 25 years ago to today, is just night and day different.
Yeah, I mean, you used to have to recruit a kid, but then once you got him on campus, you were good. Now you've got to recruit him every year and keep him there, because somebody's offering them a bunch of money to transfer, even if they haven't even done much for them already.
Yeah, especially if you're at a school like in Montana, if you have a kid that ends up being a real star standout, it's almost guaranteed that he's going to jump to a bigger school.
Yeah, those smaller, like you're right, the FCS schools and some of those, even if it's a smaller FBS school, if they're really, really good, they're going to get recruited to jump up.
Yeah.
Um, so when I was out, Bert and I were out at the farm over at the end of last week, doing some 3D, and he drove me by the building that he said I guess it was either where you were displaying your knives. But he kind of told me really briefly the story, about how you had been doing this for a long, long time, obviously, but at that Winter Strong event was really kind of the impetus for you to really hammer this thing. And the thing that I've kind of heard as I've listened to you talk about that story, not just about Winter Strong, but also about kind of having the motivation, or at least the belief to do this, is your wife, is Jess.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your partnership, because I've experienced some of the same things, in my life, but it seems like some of these really big decisions she's been a really big part of.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't have a supportive wife in college football coaching, then it's not going to work well for you with the hours that you guys put in. But yeah, no, this was an idea that MKC was an idea that I had. I registered the name with the state of Montana when I was 19. But I didn't launch it till I was 39.
You had
And
it
there was,
in the cocoon for a while.
yeah, there was several factors that personally, professionally, different things of why I didn't launch it for a long time. And I talked about it um, to a ridiculous amount, crazy degree of talk and no action. I think a few of my buddies I talked to about it so much probably thought I was never going to do it, and I was just all full of shit. But some of that was, I wasn't necessarily, I felt like married to the right person when I was early on in my life, and trying to decide to build this brand. And I ended up with 4 kids, and divorced, and four amazing kids and all that. But when I was divorced, I was just kind of a single guy, just doing the single dad thing, and doing the lineman stuff for the power company. And when I met my now wife Jessica, uh, as we got pretty serious, I told her about my idea of Montana Knife Company, and we talked about it a little bit. And when we were married, I was talking about it some more, and she was just like, "Well, you should quit your job and do that." Like, her attitude was just like, basically, you should just bail off and do it. And I
Had
was
you
like,
ever
"Well,
had anybody tell you that before, prior to
no,
her?
not like, not with my ex-wife, and no. And honestly, when you have 4 young kids, that's a huge time responsibility, a huge responsibility. So when I was single, I definitely didn't feel like I had the time to try to launch a brand. Um, and she had that attitude of like, I've got the house and the kids, you go to the shop and you go build this company. And it was definitely her that was like the driving factor, that I finally felt like I had somebody behind me that was really truly got like the potential of what it could be, and that she was truly supportive. And of course, she was almost too supportive. She wanted me to just quit my job and go after it. And I was like, well, slow down. We gotta build this a little slower than that. But once I got prototypes made and stuff, we went to Winter Strong, and Jess came with me, and it was a really nice invitation from another knife maker, Neil Kamamura, that invited me to forge and come out there and demonstrate.
So you were forging out there in that building, right? That's
Yep,
kind of along the right-hand side of the road when you pull
yep,
through.
yep. And Neil and I kind of did some demos there, and he did a really nice introduction of me and talked about my accomplishments and stuff as a custom maker. But what was cool is I brought some prototypes that I was already working on for MKC, and I showed them around. And what people probably have unfortunately never had the opportunity to hang out at a place like that. It was with probably that year there was probably 80 to 100 incredibly accomplished people, and not necessarily from a financial standpoint, from accomplishments of just hard work paying off and whatever they do. So maybe it was a college football coach, maybe it was a college football player, it could be someone in business, all walks of life. From, Sornex and Bert really has an interesting collection of friends from the sports world, which is what comes from their weightlifting and their fitness equipment business. But then also from the outdoor world, which is Bert and Pops's passion with hunting. And so there were people from the outdoor industry there as well, and also some military veterans and active duty guys. And so there's this interesting mashup of people. But when you start talking to these people, every single one of them were incredibly accomplished in their particular lives in their field, and everybody that I kind of talked to about MKC was just like, you can do this, go for it. Like, you can build this. And they were very motivating. And, they say you're the, what do they say? You're the average of your 5 closest friends or whatever.
Yeah, that's
Well, when you,
it's
when
so
you
true.
surround yourself with 80 or 100 of those people, you want to elevate yourself, and you want to, I didn't consider myself to be on that level, even though I was pretty accomplished with the custom knife making career. Um, and it just gave me a lot of confidence that we could build this brand and make it work. And so Jess and I came home from there, uh, and that was actually in February of 2020. So when we came home from there, in the next 2 weeks, the world fell apart with COVID. Uh, and we made a decision. We were not going to take no for an answer. I was going to basically ignore COVID. It had nothing to do with what I was trying to build. And we just kind of went forward building the brand in 2020. And then I didn't quit my full-time job until December 30th of 2020. So that whole year I kind of worked after work and before work, building the brand along with my business partner, Brandon, who I met because of Winter Strong as well.
Yeah, it's when I heard you tell that story the first time, it resonated with me because we've my wife and I have built multiple businesses together and sold some of them. But the second one we built, which was one of the biggest ones, we had been planning for 2 years, and the business was, it was a space that we had built out and put a bunch of money into, and it was slated to open October of 2008. And the housing bubble popped about 3 or 4 months before that. And it was like, everyone was like, you are insane. But we were pretty much all in at that point. And so,
Yeah.
we kind of did the same thing. We just said, you know what, failure's not an option. And we had some background in sales and marketing that I think put us in a position probably above some of the other people we're competing against. And so we just kind of blew open the market and decided to take a much bigger piece of a smaller pie, and it worked. But I always have a ton of respect for people that have the courage to do that when it looks like it's not the smart thing to do, because they believe in what they're doing.
Yeah. And I kind of, frankly, and back in 2010, when I got my job with the power company, I'd been making knives for about 8 or 10 years, full time. And back then, that 08, 09 crisis, if you listen to the news, the world was ending, and we were going to head into a depression. And
Oh
it
yeah,
was
it
like,
sounded like everything was just going to tank.
it was. And, I had 4 young kids, and I wasn't really getting ahead, it felt like. And looking back on it, I think I'd have been just fine, and I'd have been totally successful because I was doing pretty well with what I was doing back then. But I kind of ran from my career at that point and took the safe route with the power company. And I wouldn't go back and change any of it because it led me to where I am today. But when I was faced with some of that, it really felt similar in 2020, that like the world's ending and the economies are going to crash and everything's doomed. And this time it felt so similar to 2020. And this time I was like, or it felt similar to 2010. And I told my wife, this time we are not even watching the news. I'm
Smart
just going to
decision.
completely ignore it. And I've really kept that attitude since. My head's not in the sand, but it's definitely, I don't look up and watch the news very often. I just kind of keep a low level of need to know information going through my head. But I think so much of that stuff is designed to keep you in front of the TV and keep you scared and keep you turning the channel on the next day to see what's going on. And it really keeps you from chasing your own dreams, and it keeps people in a state of fear. And you know, it's definitely not easy, and it's definitely a little bit crazy, but to just jump off and quit your job and start something. But I also didn't do it, you know, in an uncalculated way. I mean, you know, I did a lot of work for about a year and a half before and after work before I ever decided to do that. It's not like I just decided to change. And that's one thing I see people, you know, they say, well, I'm trying to start my business. I'm trying to do this or that. I don't have time. And it's like, well, when do you get up? It's like, well, I get up at 7. It's like, well, why don't you get up at 4:30 or 5? And why don't you go to bed at 11? And, you know, when you get off your work at 5 o'clock at night, you got 5, 6 more hours in your day if you use them wisely, and maybe a couple in the morning. That's damn near an 8-hour day that you can put in. And when I look back at the people who settled the West, I don't think they were working an 8-hour day.
Hell no, they weren't.
You know,
The
they
other
might have
thing,
been in the dead of winter, you know, but I guarantee in the summer they weren't.
well, the other thing too that you know, what I see this a lot more with probably people who are, I don't know, 30, you know, and younger, maybe a little bit, you know, mid 30s and younger, is this idea that they want, you know, to be where you are, you know, 6 months after they start,
Yeah.
you know, and they're not willing to go, you know, learn from somebody who knows what they're doing. I mean, that's the advice that I've given to every one of my kids is whatever you want to do, get with the best person you can find, create relationships. It doesn't matter how much money you make, figure out how to make it, but go get, you know, underneath somebody's wing that really knows what they're doing and learn. And that there's so much value to that. Like you won't be able to do that on your own for 10 years. What you can accomplish in 12 to 18 months with somebody that knows what they're doing is going to be the foundation for what you want to do for the next 20 years. But no one seems to want to do that anymore.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, I I also think people have to be willing to try different jobs and bounce around, you know, the get different experience. It's funny because you know, I think sometimes even my own kids think like, well, dad, you know, you were making knives, you started making knives when you were 11. You knew what you were going to do your whole life. And it's like, well, yeah, I was making knives when I was 11. I was also mowing lawns. I was also working my parents' excavation business. And then when I went to college, you know, I basically flunked out of that because I duck hunted too much. And then I went back to working for my parents in their excavation. And then when I moved to Missoula, I worked in the excavation world for a different contractor here in Missoula. Then I became a knife maker. Then I became a welder. I was actually trying to become a welder for the power company, and then switched from that to a lineman. And then finally, when I was 39 years old, I switched back to, you know, to starting Montana Knife Company. So the point is, you know, it doesn't all happen when you're 25 years old, when you're fresh out of college, and it doesn't all happen in a heartbeat. And even like in the coaching world, uh, you know, you see guys start in high school and then they go to a JUCO and then they go to Division II and they're a special teams coach and then they're you know, a line coach. And a lot of these guys don't get a head coaching job until they're 45 years old.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a few exceptions of superstars that become a head coach when they're in their late 20s, but you know, that's definitely the exception to the rule. So your point is well taken that young people need to understand that. I tell my kids it's like stacking up a big pile of sand that's 50 feet tall, but you're stacking one grain of sand at a time. It's going to take decades.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you because I've done the same thing, right? I coached college football for 10 years. Then I went into like, okay, what can I do when I leave that? Well, I learned recruiting is sales. So then I went into medical sales and I learned sales and marketing and product launching and all those kinds of things. And then took that knowledge with my wife and we used that, to start other businesses. But we could have never have done what we did in our mid 30s if I hadn't learned all those things that I did from the time I was 22 in the other positions that I was in. And one took me to the next, took me to the next. And so like the grain of sand analogy is a great analogy. It's you can't fill that thing up, right out of the gate. It's going to take time. And if you don't understand that, you're going to constantly be frustrated. But if you can accept this is a journey and that every piece of that journey is going to prepare you for the next step, then you're going to be a lot better off. And then you got a chance because you don't feel like you're a failure if you haven't made your business successful at 28. Like that's one of the things that I've run into with my oldest son is, he's only 30, but he feels like he should be at this place,
Yeah.
and I'm like, no, like you can't, you gotta, like your expectation of yourself is way too high. You've got to just learn and embrace the process.
Yeah. And it seems like when it happens, it seems like things start to really come together quickly in a hurry, like, uh, what was it in 2021, I turned 40 and that was in April 1st. And so January 1st, I'd quit my job. So just before I was 40, I literally was quitting my job with no employees, just Brandon and I, no paycheck coming from this company. We didn't take a paycheck for like 6 months. Uh, had probably 6 months of savings saved up to try to launch Montana Knife Company. So at 40 years old, I was really in like just barely starting, and here I am, just a couple years later at 42 years old, and we have 25 employees, and things are growing really well.
But you're an overnight success, right?
Yeah, exactly. 30-year overnight success. But the point is like, I remember that feeling at 30 and talking about Montana Knife Company with my friends and just feeling like, man, maybe it's never going to happen. And if you'd have told me at 30 that I wasn't going to start it for 10 more years or 9 more years, I'd have probably been pretty discouraged. But I think there's something to be said, though, for building that wisdom, making those connections, building your network of friends and colleagues, and learning different things. And then when you're finally ready to go, you've actually gotten all the tools, and I think then if I'd have launched Montana Knife Company when I was 24, even just being old enough to admit that I didn't know everything about like marketing, for example.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say getting connected to the right people, like and Brandon, which obviously has played a huge, huge part in what y'all have done.
Yeah, it became very apparent to me in a hurry when I was paying him to do some things that he knew a lot that I didn't know, and I knew that there's two parts of a business. You have to make a product, and then you have to sell a product.
You
Well,
said you met him at Winter Strong?
Well, I actually was asking those. I was asking some of Bert's photo guys, photo video guys. I said I need to find a guy to take some. All I was looking for was a guy to take some pictures. I said, yeah, I need to find a guy up there in Montana that can take some good photos of me and my shop so I can build a website. And it was actually those guys that said, hey, I actually know a guy in Montana and he's really good. And it was just that much. They put us in a text. He was 2 hours from me, and I hired him to come down and take some photos after I got back. But that age or wisdom or whatever you want to call it, lack of an ego, to just say to my wife, this guy's really good. I don't know it. I'm going to give him a large percentage of the company because I need his help. And I think he can help grow this brand. And I didn't have the money to pay him what he was worth. So instead I offered him basically, I offered him equity in the company, And I actually offered him a substantial amount because I wanted him committed like I was,
Right.
and I guess I could have been selfish and said, well, geez, that if this thing gets big someday, that could be worth millions of dollars. I don't want to give that up. And my point is like, well, if his is worth millions of dollars someday, mine will be worth millions of dollars. Right. And instead of trying to keep it all for myself, had I not done that, who knows if we'd even be close to where we are today,
Yeah, I mean I will say that being in the business with other kinds of businesses that have to do those things, the social media, the branding, all the things that y'all are doing on YouTube, on Instagram, they're really not just high quality production, but the concept behind it, the way that you look at those things, the way they're presented, is super representative of the brand. I mean, it's really seems to me like it really gets the brand across. I mean, it hit home when I was looking at it more from the eye of somebody who, like, I'm not a producer of that stuff, but I kind of am in the middle of doing some of those things. And it's amazing. What is Brandon, or what was his background before he joined you?
Well, when I met him, he was working for the clothing brand Flag Nor Fail, here in Montana. He was really the marketing kind of genius behind that brand becoming big. And then before that, he was in the supplement world, kind of helping market, actually kind of going way back after he got out of college, like the GNC type days, the protein powders and all that kind of stuff. So that's really kind of his background, was in that supplement world, and then into the clothing and branding type, world.
But he had a lot of experience in the digital space, obviously.
He did, yeah. So his job in all those was marketing, and it was e-com, and it was email, collection and data stuff, and it was all directly related to marketing. So it doesn't really, matter what you're selling. I was able to educate him on the knife side and provide him with the information that he needs to do his marketing in a way that sounds legitimate for knives. But he could sell a snowball to an Eskimo.
Yeah, he does a hell of a job. What the t-shirt that I've got on, which just came out like, I don't know, a few weeks ago, but it's the back of it says "Risk it all for the brand." What does that mean?
Yeah,
to MKC?
That was really when Brandon and I both quit our jobs. And frankly, he had kind of quit his job. He was already headed that way because he was starting his own marketing agency.
Good timing.
But MKC was almost kind of more going to be somewhat of a client of his at that moment. But then over the next 2 or 3 months, like, we kept growing and growing. And then all of a sudden he had to kind of stop taking outside, customers on his agency side. And then the more we grew over the next 6 months, he actually had to start dropping people because Montana Knife Company became all the work that he was doing,
Yeah.
But that risk it all for the brand was like both of us, when I quit my job December 30th, it was entirely to build Montana Knife Company, the brand. And that brand also kind of relates to a cattle brand. Actually, I guess I'm wearing the hat I see here.
Yeah, I got it on the shirt.
It's actually, yeah, I see that. Thanks for wearing that. It's meant to look like a cattle brand, and then actually the C on this is actually meant to look like our tong, like my forging tongs.
Oh, I love that.
And it's also kind of a shout out to farmers and ranchers. And a lot of farmers and ranchers, they risk everything every single year for the brand, for their cattle brand, for their ranch or their farm that they're on. A lot of times these guys empty their savings account every spring to buy fertilizer and buy seed and buy fuel.
Yeah.
All hoping that at the end of the year it's going to pay off, but they're literally risking it all for the brand that they're putting on their cattle or their horses, and that's
how
kind
this
of
company
similar
got
to
built.
what we did.
I mean, right? That's how the country got built.
Exactly.
And that's how you're building your business, which is, I think that really resonates with people, especially certain types of people, same kind of people, self-reliant people, people who are, whether they own their own businesses, hunters, farmers. I didn't know the tong thing, but there was something about the just the branding that you do that felt to me like it resonated back to a lot of my roots, with my family farming and those kinds of things. That's like, I love that part, and how you do such a great job of making people feel that through the marketing that you do.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah.
So I know you're low on sleep. How are you balancing all this stuff, man? I know you got 4 kids. Are 2 of them in college and 2 of them still in high school?
One's in college, and
Okay,
then got 2 in high school now, and an 8th grade daughter.
gotcha.
Um, yeah, it's not managing the sleep well.
Too
uh,
much travel or just too much work?
just yeah, work and travel. Just we also try to stay very connected to our collectors and our customers. So you know, not only are we trying to make all these moves to grow the brand, I'm also frankly do a lot of research on how to. I'm still learning on how to set up a manufacturing facility. The bigger it gets, the more there is to learn. Hiring people, looking over resumes, considering the different marketing opportunities that are coming in, and then um, also trying to stay connected to our customers through social media messages. We try to answer everything that comes in, all the emails, doing the podcast, uh, trying to make sure we have a podcast coming out every Monday. Um, and so sleep and fitness has definitely slipped a bit. I'm actually kind of, well, I never drink water, and I'm actually been drinking on the podcast here. I'm making an effort right now to kind of start getting back in shape. Right the minute I went to do that, I went to pull my bow back on Saturday, and man, I did something my shoulder. I actually have an appointment at the doctor here in about an hour. I
Oh,
think I
you
did
tweaked it,
something
huh?
to my rotator cuff. Yeah,
Oh, geez.
but so I went for a run this morning and kind of held my arm because every time I was bouncing, it hurt. But I might not be in Bert's weight room anytime soon. But yeah, it's a tough balance. But honestly, again, some of that's just time management and excuses. I just got to be better about scheduling in and not allowing other things to bump that out.
Yeah, I made a recommitment to that back in December of last year. Um, I had like 3 back surgeries in the last 6 years. Um, kind of struggled with a bunch of stuff. Luckily, I found a really good physical therapist finally who helped correct some things, and I've kind of set this thing where I get up every morning at 4:30 and do my Bible study, and then I'm in the gym by 5:30, and um, it's helped me a ton just mentally being in a better place, when I start the actual workday. And I think lots of times we feel like, oh, I don't have time for it because I have all these other things going on. But then when you actually make the time for it, you're just in such a better mental place that you're more productive, even if you're giving up an hour in the morning that you would be on email or something like that.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's 100%. What I tend to do is I tend to wake up like most people. I immediately look at my phone, and then it's 2 hours later on the West Coast, right? So, or on the East Coast. So
Yeah. Everybody's
if
rolling
it's
already.
6 in the morning, here it's 8 in the morning there, and I'm already getting messages. There's already people needing things, wanting things, and so I tend to dive into it, and I find myself an hour and a half later, still working. And then it's like, well, now it's 7:30. Employees are showing up to work, and it's like, well, I can't be in the gym working out. I need to be out there working with them. So uh, I think that's pretty typical, and it's really just a matter of setting a harder schedule and abiding by it, of carving out. Uh, Nobody's going to fault anyone for being in the gym from 5 to 6 in the morning and not answering the phone. It's just on me to commit to it.
Yeah. Well, I know you got a doctor's appointment. I'd say the last thing I just wanted to ask you about was I kind of told you that I've got this, late in the life onset of hunting thing. But
Yeah.
when I was listening to you talking to Nick Merrick, he made this comment about when you're in the mountains, you find your soul. Um, I've been out west before, and just the majesty of it like kind of blew me away. But I've found that as I've gotten older, and my dad didn't hunt, so my grandpa was a farmer, but he didn't hunt. He just farmed all the time. My brother kind of picked it up on his own, but I was kind of locked into football my whole life, and luckily through some good friends, I'm kind of learning all that stuff. But um, there's something about, as I've gotten older, this desire to connect with nature that I was never really plugged into as a kid. Um, and I know you live out in the middle of those mountains. Do you see a lot more people doing this later in life than you did before? Or is it just kind of this, community that I've run into that seems so special?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't have numbers to back it up, but it definitely seems like more and more people are getting into it. I think, frankly, I think one of the big factors of that is you can't really ignore Joe Rogan's impact. Um, Rogan's a guy that, frankly, is probably the most powerful, most heard voice on the planet, but for sure in our country, by far. And he talks about archery hunting, and he talks about being out in the wild and stuff a lot. I think that's had a big part of it. Social media, back in the 90s, all the guys that I knew that hunted, uh, they really only showed people pictures or talked about it in the bar. uh,
They were in the woods all the time, right? So you really didn't get to, if you weren't tied into that community, you didn't get to see it and see what it offered.
yeah. So if you were a random guy in South Carolina or North Carolina or wherever, Kentucky, or in a wheat field in Kansas, uh, unless you specifically bought a hunting magazine or subscribed to a TV show, when were you ever going to be really exposed to hunting out west, a mule deer and elk? And nowadays with social media, you can just be a random. You could just have a friend, say such as yourself, um, one of your football buddies that's never hunted a day in his life can all of a sudden see what you're doing and be like, what the hell is he doing? And start like looking at it, talking to you about it, and be exposed to it in a way that that guy probably never would have been before. Um, and then I agree. I think once people get out in those mountains, my wife and I just did a big hike on Sunday,
Yeah, I saw that.
and
That was beautiful.
part of me wonders every time we're coming down from that why we aren't doing it every single weekend. Because it's so enjoyable. And frankly, I don't enjoy the gym. I really don't enjoy going and working out in the gym. I did more when I was in really good shape and I felt like I was making gains. Uh, but when I feel like I'm just a fat piece of shit and I'm in there and I'm pretty much just miserable and I hate myself for getting out of shape.
Get rid
But
of the
when I'm,
mirrors.
but when you're hiking, you're maybe just as miserable physically but there is no misery about it. You're just tired. Your legs are tired, but you're constantly seeing scenery and you're hearing the birds and the fresh air. And then it feels like it's very hard sometimes to measure that success in the gym. If I go spend an hour in the gym tomorrow morning and I work as hard as possible, uh, you just kind of have to believe you accomplished something. Where when we hiked 2,000 feet in elevation gain and you're standing on top of the mountain, there's that direct payoff of that hike that's like, damn, like all that work like got us to right here. And there's a direct payoff beyond just the physical fitness part of it. And it's really cool, just going out and hiking, not even just the hunt. And then obviously the hunt adds an incredible amount of difficulty to it. And there's I think it's part of why so many athletes and coaches and people like that love to get into hunting post career, because there's frankly more failure than there is success. And I think you find that a lot on baseball, diamond, football field. You might be a D end and you might try and sack the quarterback, for 80 plays in the entire game, and you might not get one sack.
Right.
I guess technically you kind of failed 80 times in a row. You know, um, you're a Hall of Fame baseball player if you bat, you know, if you hit 33 out of 100 balls.
Mm-hmm.
Means you failed 77 times. And you know, so with hunting, you know, typically the odds are that you're going to go out and you're going to fail, quote unquote, fail. But boy, once you break through and you get that sack or you get that, you know, that animal down with your bow or your rifle, that feeling of success just feels that much better. And it's just incredible, you know. Um, and I think that's why it resonates with people that, especially people that have kind of been in a life of competition and a life of failure and success, you know.
Yeah. I'm gonna do a whitetail hunt up in southern Illinois this fall because I've got family that's got big farmland up there. But honestly, when I first got interested in this, what I really want to do is elk hunt. I'm not going to do it this fall because my daughter's a senior in high school and she's on a competitive team and she's
Yeah.
busy all fall, and I don't want to miss anything of hers. But I'm planning one for fall of 24, and so I'm doing like a 10-mile ruck on Saturdays and like one in the middle of the week on top of weight training. But the first time I ever saw, and this was on YouTube, but the first time I ever saw an elk bugle with the mountains in the background, I was like, holy shit, I got to freaking do that, you know?
Yeah.
And then what you said, I started really studying it and learning how freaking hard it is, which made it even more attractive to me.
Yeah, that there is no greater sound to me in nature than an elk. It's just, especially on a cold morning, you're hiking along and you bugle and you're waiting, and 2 minutes later, just out of thin air, you hear this bugle off in the distance, and it's this beast that's calling back to you, that wants to fight, you know, and it's pretty incredible.
There's something
It's
primal about that, you know?
There is, and then, you know, I'd be curious to see how your experience goes, but it's interesting because, you know, I just went hunting with a, you know, I don't know if he'll be in the Hall of Fame, but he's a high level athlete. You know, Derek Wolf, that was a
Yeah, I watched
D,
that.
D lineman, for the Broncos, Super Bowl champion, absolute savage beast of a man.
Yeah, the guy's a stud.
And you know, we went black bear hunting, and you know, quite honestly, the mountains kicked his ass. They kicked all of our asses, right? But you can only prepare so much with a heavy backpack on and a gym, and all of a sudden you get at a little elevation, and uh those mountains will absolutely crush you. It's just crawling over logs, and you know, we had a lot of rain, so it was wet conditions. You're slipping, you're falling, you're clawing for, you know, for every step. And it's humbling. That's the other thing about hunting, is even if you are really truly physically fit and you go in the mountains and you do well, you still feel insignificant. Like the the most fit athlete, you know, Cam Haines type hunter, uh, can spook an elk, and that elk can run over 3 ridges in 5 minutes, and it would take Cam 3 hours to get to that elk. You know,
Hmm.
that elk just did in 5 minutes. And we watched even like a black bear run up a hillside and then climb a tree, and it's like no human on earth can run up a hillside like that in that amount of time and climb a tree with really like no effort. It's just, uh, Mother Nature's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I'm actually, you know, as I look at it and look at some of the stuff I've done in the past versus this, you know, you don't ever want to regret anything, but I really am, uh, I'm sorry that I didn't like figure this out sooner and recognize what it was sooner because it looks like that. And I have talked to people that have done it, and that's what they basically told me the same thing. We're like, look, if you go out and get something, that's cherry. Like, but if you go out there and just make it the first time, you know, and just know that you're going to get your ass kicked. But
Yeah.
you go out, you know, the mountain's going to challenge you. No matter how much you train, it's going to be a lot harder than you think it's going to be. But you know, the whole kind of this ethos that a lot of us, you know, as athletes and hunters have is kind of embracing the suck. They're like, you just got to be there, and just kind of know that the beauty and the experience of being there, as long as you're strong enough to just make it through, is going to be worth it. And it's a lot like the other thing. Once you're done with it, you're never going to want to do anything else.
Yeah, and there's so much knowledge that uh, a lot like football, you can be as prepared as you want to be. You can be athletic as you want to be, the strongest arm. But really, what makes the difference between a great quarterback and an okay quarterback is you could actually argue that most of the okay quarterbacks that are first, second year in the league are actually more physically gifted than all of the old quarterbacks that are actually great. But
Agreed.
what makes them great is the knowledge that they've got. And that's one thing that you just can't really attain when you're sitting at home preparing for a hunt. If you've never hunted in areas, you walk up into the mountains and all of a sudden you realize that, gosh, I thought there was going to be water here. The Onyx maps show that there's water here. There's no water. And that all of a sudden your whole entire game plan changes. Like, I thought the animals were going to be coming to this little draw for water. Well, where's the closest water? It's like, oh, the closest water is 3 miles away. Um, you know, well, I didn't bring enough water in my pack to last me for 2 days because I thought I was going to fill my Nalgene right here.
Mm-hmm.
you know, where are the bedding areas and where does the wind direction come from? And I think that's where a lot of the failure comes from new hunters in the beginning, is just going into the mountains and kind of learning the terrain and learning how animals move. Maybe those animals spend June and July there, but water dries up, feed changes, patterns change, and then they spend September and October in a different place.
Yeah.
And that's just stuff that you have to learn over time. And I think besides the physical fitness part, it's funny. I actually have a buddy of mine that he's kind of an out of shape fat bastard, but he always kills stuff
Because he knows what the
and
hell he's doing, right?
yeah, and it's kind of like Tom Brady and Peyton Manning couldn't run away from uh, anybody. They couldn't run at all, but they stood in the pocket and kept winning Super Bowls. And you're like, how the hell does that guy do that, right? And it's that knowledge.
Yeah, I feel like when I was 20. So I remember when I was a young football coach, and I remember being around all these guys that have been doing it forever and thinking, God, how in the hell do you learn that much information? Like, how do you have that kind of knowledge that you can just look at a defense or look at a coverage and figure out how to attack it? But obviously, over time, you figure that out, and that's how I feel right now with hunting. Is I know how much I don't know, and I know that the only way you really learn that is to be out there. So I know the learning curve is really, really steep, but I think
You're
that's,
filling that dump truck with sand one pinch at a time.
yeah, that's exactly right.
You know,
Yeah,
uh,
man.
that's I don't care what you're in, and that's what I try to get across to my kids. I don't care if it's football. I don't care if it's business, if it's marketing. One thing that's always true, pretty much across the board, uh, is that if to have any real great level of success, you have to one pinch of sand at a time. You
That's
know,
right.
um, and every now and then you'll see somebody come into a profession super young and really accomplish great things, but that's the number one draft pick, and let's face it, most of us aren't.
That's right.
you know
Well, man, y'all are kicking ass. I really appreciate you taking the time, get just jumping on. But I also, the whole reason I started this podcast, honestly, for me, was to get to know people that are just awesome people that are doing things that I respect, doing things that I admire, and just increase my circle of really good people around me. So I really appreciate you taking an hour to sit down and talk to me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. And Bert's a great friend. I
Amazing
actually
guy.
just
Amazing
missed a
guy.
call from him about a half hour ago. So Bert's an amazing guy, and I agree with you. I mean, the most enjoyable part of building a brand like this is the people I get to associate with, the people I get to be around. Um, it's absolutely my favorite part. That and doing a little hunting. But no, I
Well,
wish you the best of luck with taking off into the hunting. I think it's awesome. I think a lot of ex-athletes and a lot of ex-military guys really tend to gravitate towards hunting because it's an incredible challenge, and both in athletics and in what a lot of our veterans have experienced with war, um, someone else has a vote, and in hunting, an animal also gets a vote.
yeah,
The defensive lineman wants a sack in a game, but he's going against somebody that doesn't want him to have a sack. So, uh, there's it's cool to be engaged in a pastime like this that you're not in control. You can do everything right, and even at that point, you can do everything right and miss or screw up.
yeah, that's right. Finally get set up for the shot and then whiff, right?
Exactly. So it's it's a pretty cool pastime.
Yeah, it is. Are you going back out to Winter Strong this year? Do you
I'll
go out
go to
there every
Winter
year?
Strong as long as I'm invited.
Awesome. Well, then I'll get a chance to meet you. That'll be great.
Awesome.
Well, I know you got a doctor's appointment. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, keep getting after it with MKC. I just got my Blackfoot last week.
That's awesome. Well, I really do appreciate the support.
Yeah.
It means a lot, and I appreciate you having me on here.
When I get that first buck this fall and I start working on it, I'll send you a picture.
I can't wait. I can't
Thanks,
wait.
brother. Have a
All
great
right,
day,
thank
man.
you.
All right.
You
Thanks so
too.
much. Bye bye.
Bye.